My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm so excited to bring you to our 5th season. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Mikey Latner, and I wanted him to come on to talk about his project, which is called Project Camp. Essentially what it is a pop-up camp for children, and it is deployed after disasters. Now, this is a very simple idea, but just so important, because one of the things that we most overlook in disaster is the sphere of mental health. Mental health is very much a huge challenge after a major disaster. There's the initial trauma, and then there's the trauma that actually goes on for years. And unless a community is able to actually do very tangible things to really mitigate the trauma response in children and adults, then the actual prospect of how long that trauma will go on is really something quite stark. So today I wanted Mikey to come on to talk about his work. I love that he works across all disasters, and I really love that he's taken sort of this simple idea and then applied it to a very real problem, which is, helping children be children even during a disaster, and helping them have fun and to and have a place where they can sort of get away from how serious it is, but really attend to their social and emotional needs. And so please welcome to the podcast, Mikey Latner, Project Camp. Welcome to the How to Disaster podcast. Today I have with me Mikey Latner. Mikey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
So I wanted you to come on to talk about your own journey into the disaster field, but really to focus on what you created here with Project Camp. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Project Camp, what we do is we provide care for children, and by extension, relief for families and resilience for communities. It comes really from my personal story. I grew up going to summer camp as a kid, working summers as a staff member, and then I was a summer camp director for over a decade. And it was in the immediate response to Hurricane Harvey that I was able to actually go with a group of camp directors down to Houston while schools were closed immediately after the hurricane and set up a pop-up day camp. And that provided a space for kids to be kids and relief for the families to muck and gut homes, to be able to navigate emergency services, to have the space to process themselves. And so we set up Project Camp to do exactly that, to create a space where kids can be kids, and by extension, really lean on what we believe is a pillar of our communities, our economy, our society as a whole, which is childcare.
Oh, that's so true. Soft infrastructure is so important. We've only had federally subsidized soft infrastructure in the form of childcare during World War II, so women could go to work. Side note, for those of you who didn't know, that we did once upon a time
have it. It's a great piece of history. I love that.
Yeah, it is, right? It's very, when people are like, that's never been done, you're like, but maybe it has.
Thank you, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, right. Such a queen. I love a queen. But what I'm always impressed is when people see a need and to actually zero in on that moment when you were watching Harvey from home. I see you guys are based in Los Angeles, so that's here. At the same time, like a couple months later, we had our fires in the North Bay, and then there's the Thomas fire in your own backyard. But what really prompted you, even with all of your experience, to look at Harvey and to say, I think there's an opportunity here? Did you have a family member or some kind of connection there?
The summer camp I was working at was actually in Northern California, and I'm glad you mentioned it because that camp was actually burnt down in a subsequent fire the same year. But our sister camp in Texas really leaned on its Houston community and reached out and said, what can we do? And once schools were closed immediately after the hurricane, was right before Labor Day. The community really responded with the need for childcare, and it was unique for me to see the application of a skill set and a perspective that I had, and I didn't really originally think about it in terms of applying it to disaster relief in that space, but being able to go down there and to be able to get involved, we set up a 12-day camp for about 350 kids. We served 500 meals a day, to be able to see a skill set leveraged in a totally new way when kids and parents needed it most, when it could be accessible and useful to the community. For me, that really just sparked a light bulb. And both fortunately and unfortunately had the chance to pop up camps again after the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, which burnt down the camp that I was working at. And then about a year.
Were you at Camp Newman? Where were you?
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah. I used to
I
be a
know
director
Camp
of Camp
Newman.
Newman.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
amazing.
totally.
That's a
Yeah.
very small world.
Yeah,
So
that is a very small world.
we set up another camp in the Santa Rosa community. I'm 2 for 3 on this, but the summer camp that I grew up at down here in Los Angeles also burnt down in the Woolsey fire. We were able to set up another pop-up camp, and all of those opportunities were really ad hoc, but it really, for me, solidified this space, as you said, for soft skill support, for the need for childcare and that kind of service delivery during this time of crisis. We lean a lot, I think, in our society on childcare, but schools specifically. We saw a lot of this in COVID and how schools became this huge delivery mechanism. They're constantly a delivery mechanism for components of providing social support, social welfare. And so disaster relief needs the same thing. Disaster relief needs a space where we can provide that, like I said, the support for kids, because it has so many knock-on effects. It's their own long-term mental health. It's the ability for parents to, we were recently in Florida, in Southwest Florida, after Hurricane Ian, and we were working predominantly with the kids of utility workers, police, fire, medical, county workers. The only way for that community to be able to have the staff out doing the heavy lifting to get the community up and running again is if they're able to go to work, if they have reliable childcare.
And that's such an important thing to actually see. And, so I just have to applaud you for that too, is I don't think most people think about that when they're looking at, the firefighter who's coming to save your home, or, your community, the police officers, like you saw the Tubbs fire was really North Bay Complex fires. We had over 11 major fires during that time. But, we had all of these other deputies even come from Alameda and other places because they were bilingual, and they had to serve, day and night for many, many days. Like, they have families and lives. And so we have to be able to support the helpers as well. And so I really applaud you for that. If I can just go back for, your first experience with Harvey really quickly. One of the things that I know drew me into this work was because I started during the Tubbs fire time as well. Was
I didn't know that.
That's how. Oh yeah, that's my whole origin story. Yeah, I worked for the county at the time. So, I even though it was the most terrifying physical experience of my life, and it was also the most amazing human experience, and I was so moved by how people responded. Well, except for a small group of people that I still have a little list because whatever else. But for the most part, people were wonderful. And Rebecca Solnit calls this a paradise built in hell. And I don't know if you've read that book, but she's a beautiful writer. And one of the things is that when we are confronted with major disasters or catastrophes, that most of the time people lean towards each other. And we usually don't fall into a catastrophe like COVID, where people then start to go at each other. So what did you learn in Harvey that sort of moved you? Because this is now your life's work.
Yeah. The thing I really like to share, honestly, is so look at me. I'm not a firefighter. So when there is a wildfire, you shouldn't send me to the fire line. Like, that's not where my skill set is. But in all of our communities, we have a wide variety of skill sets. One of those skill sets is youth professionals. So teachers, after-school care professionals, teens and young adults with babysitting experience. All of this exists in our community. So when looking at us and thinking about ourselves, it's really about creating pathways for members of a community to get involved in response and recovery in the best way that they can, really utilizing those skill sets. So those really that's how we recruit volunteers. And we like to say, we don't train people to work with kids, but we leverage those within the community who already work with kids to do that work. And that manifests itself in some really powerful ways. When we were working in Plumas County during the Dixie Fire in Northern California.
I worked there too. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
This is a very small community.
Yeah.
It was really, it's important for our camps all to have a level of cultural competency that can make it a meaningful, welcoming space for kids. And the majority of our volunteers were either teachers in the Plumas County public school system or in the charter schools, or they were teens from the high school. And it meant that those were volunteers that had either direct connection to the kids that were coming to camp, because some of them were literally their elementary school teachers, or they had the same lived experience. And there's something for me sitting here in Los Angeles that I can sympathize with what's happening within that community, but I can't bridge that gap. only members of the community who are experiencing that can. And it's important not just to be able to do the work well, but to be able to have the lasting impact to build the meaningful relationships that makes that work even possible from the start.
I really love that, because I think that one of the things that I think people who don't necessarily work in this space understand is, disaster response takes a lot of creativity, a lot. And it takes a
Mhm,
lot of emotional creativity and
mhm,
integrity, and to be able to walk into a community and meet them where they're at as opposed to where you want them to be.
mhm,
And I think that where we have breakdowns in disaster response is when we try as disaster professionals now to actually impose our own, worldview of how
mhm,
something should be. And how wonderful that you were also in the Plumas fire, because for people who don't know, the Dixie fire burned for about 96 days. 800, that Greenville burned down about
mhm,
midway through. 821 people who really, really loved their town, and they're rebuilding now, and that's great. And they're working on, how to like rebuild back more resiliently, all of these things. But Greenville is not Santa Rosa. They are
mhm,
not the same. One has, Plumas County has 15,000 people in it. Sonoma County has 500,000 people in it. And, rural communities, which are my personal passion, deserve a lot more respect often than they're given in this field, and the people who are residing there. And so I love that you said, bridging that gap. Like, I don't have to pretend to be them, though I do drive a truck now so that they will accept me. It's true. They didn't like my Volvo didn't play well in rural America at all.
fair, fair.
Yeah. So I go with my Ram truck, and they're like, okay, maybe she's okay. But that's a real skill, though. And what lessons have you learned along the way about adapting or serving? One of our main core values at After the Fire is serving the community that's in front of you. So tell
Mhm.
me how that manifests, because I can hear that in your language.
Look, the thing is, I think the biggest component of it that really pushes us in that direction, in addition to us wanting to create that space, is that in order to work with kids, you're literally working with the most precious, important thing to a set of parents. And so building that trust for a parent to, even in the midst of a very impactful, confusing, ever-changing disaster, to say, okay, I'm gonna leave my kid with you and they're gonna be safe. And I know that they're gonna be safe because I have to go do these other things. Creating that relationship has really meant asking and being open to feedback at all times. And we recently experienced it. We were working with both Santa Cruz County and Monterey counties in
I work
response.
there too.
Ah,
Okay.
incredible. We were really working closely with Office of Emergency Services and Office
Mhm.
of Ed, um, looking to see if we could be supportive in pop-up camp, in specifically for the community of Pajaro after the levees broke.
Mhm.
And we spent several days
Yeah.
with them really assessing need, being able to go out to the community and figure out what they needed to assess for the school districts themselves, where, what schools could be reopened, where kids could be. And we ultimately actually didn't set up camp because the schools decided we're going to send kids back. This is how we're going to adjust to, they lost a middle school, where a middle school was heavily impacted. And so they were shifting kids around. But it meant that we were able to be engaged with the community directly as a supportive resource and say, look, we are a tool in your tool belt, but it's your tool belt. When and how you need it, we can do that. Our Hurricane Ian response recently was a similar thing. We generally operate camp kind of like all day camps in 9 to 3.
Mhm.
But the Charlotte County who we were working with said, we're sending county staff on 12-hour shifts rotating. So we're going to run 7 to 7. Can you run 7 to 7? And it was important for us to be able to say yes, because if to very practically to leave the 2.5-hour gap on both ends, there's no ability for parents to be able to rely on that. And so being able to blend camp to the needs of the moment is really important to who we are as an organization. And it's really, I think, an essential aspect of camp. Anyone who's worked with kids will tell you, you should always write your plan in pencil, because the program is gonna go something's gonna go sideways. And that's part of working with kids. That's part of being a youth professional. That's part of camp. And it's ingrained in how we train our volunteers, how we build the program, how we adjust the program, that we ask the question of, what are we really trying to create? What's the space that we want to create for our kids? If our kids, we set up a really cool painting activity, and they don't want to do it because they want to be in the gym, playing basketball, let's go with them. Like, if that's what they need right now, let's do it. And another great example is in we've had teens who will come to camp who are either in a shelter environment, or they're packed in with relatives, or they're in hotel motel with whole family. And so sometimes for the first couple hours or first hour of the day, they need to like sit, charge their phone, and if we have reliable internet, they need to like be on TikTok and be on Instagram. And that's, we want to give them that space. That's how they're able to check in with each other. That's how they interact with their world. That's how they're able to decompress. What we're trying to create is a return to a sense of safety and normalcy. And if that's part of that solution, let's go with that.
I love that. Again, like that creativity and flexibility in order to meet kids where they're at and communities where they're at. Now, a really important part of what you do, which I really love too, is until really a few years ago, I think we didn't exactly understand the real importance of tackling the mental health issue after a disaster. I love that you are trauma informed. And so I'd love for you to talk about that. For people who are listening to this podcast who've never been through a disaster, you can even think you're not in trauma, but literally everybody is in trauma. And it really does last for years, but it can be mitigated. And some of the ancillary effects of that, the negative effects, domestic violence, alcoholism, things like that, can be directly positively impacted and lower the rates if you do have things like Project Camp. So kids now have been through, like in Santa Cruz, for example, they've already been through a mega fire in 2020 and COVID, and then all of these horrific flood events. And there's been a couple of them just this winter alone. So when you're dealing with compound disasters and trauma, like what have you learned through that process and what's so important? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the way we train volunteers and how we structure our program is rooted in the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study of 2011. It's a partnership between the CDC and Kaiser Foundation. And it really pinned together what we were talking about, the experiencing toxic stress like a disaster and its linkages to potentially lifelong physical, mental, and social negatives. It also created a roadmap for mitigating those long-term effects. And the overarching themes are returning to a sense of safety, reestablishing routine, building meaningful relationships. And when we encountered the ACE study really in working with a trauma therapist and LCSW, because we were looking anecdotally at camp and saying, camp we know is an inherently healing therapeutic space. Why? Like, why is that? And the ACE study doesn't specifically talk about camp, but it starts to pin together, okay, this is why having kids in meaningful community, in cabin groups with their friends, rotating through a day, being on a structured schedule, being able to, names are really important for us at camp, knowing every kid's name every day, being able to have that recognition. And I spoke a little bit about changing the plan. We train our volunteers that if the program's not working, kids want to do something else, like I said, we do that. And it's because it really is about meeting and receiving kids where they're at. And it's also about leveraging those youth professionals to be the first line of really mental health care. There's a scope of practice involved. So we're not mental health professionals. We don't train mental health workers to do this work. But like I said, if you are a youth professional, if you're a teacher, we can train you to work in camp in a trauma-informed manner, with a trauma-informed lens. And so being able to recognize, behavior issues as a reflection of the incredible stress that our kids are under, and being able to say, okay, this is how I'll receive that, and this is how we can de-escalate, this is how we can mitigate, this is how we can turn the day around. And I think being able to focus on what we can do as individuals and being able to be a link in the chain to longer term mental health support, that's really key. So we work with local therapists, with local mental health support, with school social workers, when we identify kids that require additional support, to be able to get that support for them and to get those connections for their families.
I think you hit upon something really important, which is you don't have to be a mental health professional to still be trauma informed and to be able to basically train to recognize signs and symbols and things that people need. And it's really what communities need after disaster is for as many people as possible if they can become trauma informed, then the impact is so much greater. And so, and to have a system like I love that if you see something, you can say something to somebody who is, but just the fact of taking the time and the energy to become trauma informed is so important. So I want to applaud you for that. So now you are in year 5 and a half, right? And so as a growth as an organization, and we're having so many disasters now, like how do you figure out your work plan? Or because that's a hard thing in disaster with funding and other things, is that you are essentially training for an unknown event at an unknown time in an unknown place. You know that it will happen, but that's really all you know.
Yeah, it makes scheduling vacations really hilarious.
Yeah.
But I think everyone here can relate to that. I think for ourselves, going back to the essential component of community buy-in to what we're doing, that's really for us been a guiding light in where and how to get involved. Climate change has increased the frequency and severity of disaster. You spoke to it when you were talking about the impact that several climate disasters have recently had on kids in Santa Cruz. That impact is there is a disproportionate impact that all of that is having on, like you said, rural communities, low-income communities of color. And so looking at our work, there isn't a shortage of getting involved. And so the challenge then is understanding what can we do, how can we do it, and how can we create the relationship so that the tool is actually in the tool belt. We do two things really that are two sides of the same coin. One is popping up free trauma-informed day camps in that response phase, and the other is the organizing and preparation work, where we're linking together offices of emergency services with school districts, boys and girls clubs, all youth professionals to build planning so that it's accessible when disaster strikes, to be able to create pop-up childcare.
Oh, I want to go into the relationships part because,
yeah, please.
From moment one, and I bet you had the same experience, what makes this work possible and moving is always relationships, and building them is a constant thing that I do. And I'm hearing that's a constant thing that you do. And you're often building the relationship and you have no idea how or if it's ever going to be, if it's something where you're even working together, but it's just so it's such an important part of personal and professional development. It's probably true in all professions maybe, but in this one, I feel like it's particularly true because then we'll get calls, or you'll get a call, and they'll be like, okay, I know you don't do this, but who does this, and who can, and people are in a hurry and right after a disaster, and they're really looking to fill a very particular need. So I'm sure that, that's how I have found out about you is Lorraine. And I was at the Walmart conference with her, and she said, I think she's on your board, and she was like, have you ever heard of Project Camp? And I'm like, no, but I would love to learn more. And that was a year ago. And so it took us a minute, but we're here now. So talk to us about how you build relationships. And that's a really hard thing to do in communities that have not yet been hit by disaster, because people are human and they don't like to think about it until something really happens.
Yep. And I think there's another layer of that too, is where people are looking for planning. They really are looking for something turnkey. And what we do to a certain degree is, camp, we have a ready model. We have a team that has done this many times now at this point. And so, but it really is like, how can we do this in this community in this time? And so that's why the organizing and preparation work has been so important. And it really is, because there aren't tons of people working in childcare in disaster relief. We're constantly showing, here is a gap in planning and preparation in the response, and also saying, okay, but we can also we can help you fill that gap. We can train you to do it. We can do it ourselves. And so I think what's been really positive is being able to be in rooms with emergency managers at the county level, at the state level, being able to talk to the federal government and say, this is what we do. This is an area where we're at the nexus point of childcare and mental health support and climate change. And this is how we can start to develop this. I think it also requires a sense of humility going into this. There isn't we've only been doing this for about 5 years. We are a fast growing, but we are a growing team. We cannot be currently at every every disaster. And I think our long-term vision really should be that every kid that experiences disaster should be able to have this kind of meaningful space, whether that's with us or with our school district or somebody else, but that's the systems change that we're talking about. And I think being able to talk to as many people as possible about the need for the systems change, that really creates buy-in. That's put us in a place to be like, if we do camp, we do it really well. How can we learn how we fit into your community as an emergency manager? Or how do we understand how this community's Office of Education, like how do the school districts interact, or the schools in the school district interact with each other? It puts you in the position to be, the expert in the room on what you do, but creating a table where you're asking others to come to it.
That's a really important part too, is that, and I want to touch on two things. One is the factor of humility, and the other is collaboration. And good collaboration requires a degree of humility. Also confidence in what you're bringing to the table, but humility in that, we're always learning. Like none of us have it all down, even though, I'm a wildfire expert, but I feel like I'm in my infancy stage still in learning, what to do and what's possible and what's not possible, and also to dispose of ideas that I thought were good but maybe were not actually relevant for the moment, and not become so wedded to them that I'm defensive about it even. And I find that sometimes in building relationships where I run into issues, I guess, with people who do not possess collaborative approaches or humility, and I'm like, I'm not sure how you're going to make it in this field, but also if you start with the idea of what do you need and how can I help, then I think humility stays through part of that. So while you've only been doing this for 5.5 years, same here for me. I when people are looking at maybe doing something or executing a good idea, they should not be daunted by that. You should be respectful of what people know and build relationships, but don't undersell yourself for only being in it for 5.5 years, I think. And to do something so cool, like, and I said this in the very beginning, like it's a pretty simple idea, but well executed. And so what kind of challenges in your growth, I'm going to guess it's capacity and over demand for your services, have you run up against in providing this really important, simple service that's so impactful?
A big piece of it, honestly, that supercharged things really quickly was, like you said, collaborating with some really meaningful friendships and partners. So I like to use it In-N-Out as an analogy. So we're like In-N-Out. We make a cheeseburger. We do that every time. If you ask us for a salad, that's not us. But in order to get camp up and running in a disaster, we can do it we usually do it in 48 hours. It requires those collaborative partners, and for those partners to have a similar mentality. So we have a great relationship with Airlink. They fly us, within hours notice anywhere we need to go, our whole team. We work really closely with World Central Kitchen, who has agreed to feed us wherever we go. And they've, and it goes past that. They don't simply feed us. They will look for an ice cream truck in the community. They'll get the ice cream truck to come to camp, because it's like that's camp. I think being able to leverage those kinds of other kinds of expertise that plug into you, that's allowed us to grow camp as it's like the thing that is camp, and to grow our team really focused on that, and to say, okay, we don't do mass meal service, but we know people who do it really well. I think the issue is not necessarily being inhibited by, that's not the right way to say it. I don't think that other organizations don't look for.
It's fine to stumble over it, because when people listen to this podcast, I want them to understand that this is a process, and it's always progressing, and that we acknowledge that it's not always easy, but we feel like the work is really important. And so it's that strategic, maybe the word is it strategic collaborations or what? But you can say whatever you need to say. It's okay to stumble. That's my point.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, strategic collaboration is a good way of saying it, because what I'm trying to push against is where people are siloed, where organizations will do this one thing because they know they do it well, and they only do this, and they're not looking at what others are doing in the same space or how else they're doing it. So we learn a ton from the people that we collaborate with, whether it's a community or another nonprofit in the space, because we're all trying to jump in at the same time kind of in the same space, and we all have to be able to play well in the sandbox.
Mhm.
And so it's taught us really to be able to, like I said, to be able to focus on the thing that we know we can do well, and to dive deep into how camp can be a fuel for trauma-informed care, how can we can leverage more youth professionals, and we can let World Central Kitchen figure out how they're going to feed us because they're good at it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is like the biggest thing that I've taken away in these first 5 years in how we grow. And I think it really is highlighted in how we look at our strategic planning over the next 5 years. Is this is how we're going to grow in order to do camp well and plug in more organizations that can support that effort. To plug in, big challenge for any nonprofit is fundraising. Is how do
Yeah.
we tell the story of what we do, like I said, inside of the context of all these larger issues. That Project Camp really sits at the nexus point of the need for a dearth of childcare in this country, and an increased frequency and severity of disasters is related to climate change, and the need for mental health care. How do we tell that story in a way that is energizing to those who are looking to get involved and to support that work?
I do think one of the advantages that you have is because you do sort of immediate response, there's a lot more funding in that space for the immediate what's going on. And one of the challenges that we always face is there isn't as much funding in the long-term recovery of those spaces, but that's not to in any way like cast shade upon. I'm just jealous, like, to be honest, like that part I would kind of love, because we do go in right away, but it's like when 2 years later, when we're still sitting with Paradise, or 4.5 years later, or whatever it is, I'm like, people are still not rebuilt. They still need that, but our services are just different. So I'm excited for you. That I hope that it's easier for you in that space, and I hope that people are paying attention to what an important piece you bring to this. So
Thank you.
uh,
I think there is a coordinated moment happening too, and I'm not an expert in philanthropy, but we hear more and more that foundations, people who are working in philanthropy, are thinking about general operating support, longer term support. They need to be able to carve out space so that organizations can do the work that you're talking about, that they can do over the long term. And I think what you're talking about in disaster relief in general really looks at the whole cycle of disaster relief, really looking at recovery and mitigation. And so we talk about ourselves, with the simple fact that, like, camp's it's not on a shelf. I can't just pull it off and toss it in. It requires regular maintenance. It requires and maintaining the relationships that we're talking about. And I think as philanthropy starts to move in that direction, and disasters become more frequent, as wildfire season gets longer, as hurricane season gets longer, as winter storms become more of a thing that I didn't grow up in LA understanding.
tornadoes, yeah.
Tornadoes, there was a tornado in East LA. So like all these things are happening and really painting a picture of year-round exposure, and of the need to have all those assets ready to go year-round. There isn't a season for all this anymore. It's constantly happening.
It is, and I'm glad that you pointed that out. And it's also a matter of that. There was a study by what was it? I think it's the Center for Effective Philanthropy that came out last July. That said, a lot of philanthropy has been looking at climate-based disasters, and or climate change too, and they talk about it, but they only put 2% of their resources towards it. And the reason they gave, and it was actually a very it was a very compassionate study, for the record, like understood the challenges and the barriers, but as they said, it's too hard. But I think they're also, the fact that they could admit that it's too hard instead of saying it's not important, is actually a huge step forward. So I'll take that. That's fine. But I also do wish that they would do sort of our approach, which is the same as yours. When you walk into a community or an issue, you just start talking to the people who are doing the frontline work, and it really does become clear to you. And I do see signs of change, and I'm glad for that. And I'm also glad to see less pressure on keep your administration really low, because your super talent, like what you're bringing to the table, are people, is a structure.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. And they have to be honored, and they have to also have healthcare. and they have to know that if they're going to do this stressful work, that they are not like worried about whether or not they can buy groceries for their own children while working at a food bank. Like, this is not the
Right.
world that we should be creating, but it's the world that sort of philanthropy had like valued for so long, but I am seeing a change. So
It's really moving from like goods oriented to a service oriented approach. It's that like you literally took the words right out of my mouth. Like we talk about program supplies, I'm really talking about snack, sidewalk chalk, finger paint, all those kinds of things. But it really is about leveraging people to be able to do the work that they can do in the space that it's needed. And so being able to look at, it's comparatively easier to move a pallet of water than it is to get the right mental health professional in front of the right people. It takes much more time, much more connection to community, much more infrastructure buildup. But we're recognizing more and more that these things are ever present in our lives and are useful in so many different ways that we're starting to look at, I believe, service delivery as a way of being a multi-tool, being able to use what we do as camp, being able to use the cheeseburger example and be able to apply it in a bunch of different settings. So the way we respond with camp in a wildfire versus a hurricane versus a tornado looks a little bit different every time, and who we're working with looks a little bit different, but it's the same core. And I think we're starting to understand that we can do that with services the same way, not the same way, but in similar ways that we do that with goods.
I think that's a really great distinction. I'm not even sure that I've heard it quite said like that, and I like it, and I'm going to steal it for sure.
Hey,
Which
please, I'm
is
honored.
that, well, and because actually, this is not a bad segue into my next question, which is one of the things I always like to talk about in our podcast is helping the helpers. So I see that you all are helping the helpers to make sure that they can get to work and their children are well cared for. But in your company culture, your nonprofit culture, like, how do you attend to self-care within the organization? Because most people in disaster are notoriously terrible at this particular skill.
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's one we've gotten really from the beginning, which I think I wouldn't have asked on my own coming from camp, but I think is a reflection of the growing focus on long-term mental health in this space, which I think is huge. And we were just at the International Association for Emergency Management Conference in Savannah in November, and there were tons of sessions focused on exactly this topic because COVID highlighted it. Like, burnout's real. For us, I think there are really two aspects to who we are that help us here. One is that we speak about ourselves as second responders.
Me too.
We're in.
I say
Excellent.
third even. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I love that. Sorry, interrupting.
No, not
Love
at all. We're in times really difficult space, logistically, emotionally, and we're at camp. And so what we're doing is we're not wallpapering over what's happening outside. We create meaningful space for our kids to talk about what's happening, for our volunteers to share what's happening, but we're intentionally creating a warm, receptive environment. And that's how we speak about what's going on, to the color of the shirts that we wear and the language that we use and the activities that we do is all meant to, like I said, return to that sense of normalcy and routine, to lower the stress levels so that people can process what's happening. The other piece of
But go ahead. Because I'm like, but that's not you though. Go ahead. It's true, all true. But this is very typical of somebody in this space though.
Fair. Well, the other half I think maybe speaks more to us though is we have a very personal care approach to our company culture. So taking not getting deep into like the HR components of all this, but like being able to take time when you need it. We are an all remote team, which serves us well as a disaster relief organization. We're going anywhere anyway. So we might as well be anywhere. It's allowed us to create flexibility for working parents, to create flexibility for staff members to deal with family, like personal emergencies, to be able to structure ourselves and push each other to take meaningful time off, to speak about how we take that time off and what we need. For me, like I love checking my Slack in the morning, even if I'm on vacation, not for any other reason other than I just need to know what's happening, and that allows me to move on and to not go back and check throughout the day. And so we work closely with each other to understand, like, what do we each need to push each other to separate and to take time off, and to be able to work collaboratively in that way. All of us work both offense and defense, and that allows us to understand each other's jobs so that we can fill in for each other and be able to allow each of us to take time.
That's so smart, because I think that somebody can swap in for you is the thing that I never was able to crack, in all of the years I've been doing this. It's not because I'm the best person at it, it's because it was just the nature. There was so much to do, and so
Mhm.
I've not been as intentional as you have. So it's something I could probably very much take lessons from you on. Is I recognize after about 5 years, I'm like, this is dumb as an organization to not have that component, because you should never have any organization that depends so much upon one person. Like that's not sustainable. So my goal for the next 5 years, actually the next 2 years, is to reverse that so that I am entirely not indispensable at all. So,
Oh,
that anybody
awesome.
can
Yeah.
go in and have that same thing. But it took me a long time, because every time I would add somebody to staff, I'd be like, oh, but now we can do this thing better
Mhm.
over here. So I would never put myself on the list of things that could be handled better, so good for you for seeing that early. Like that's a really big marker, you
Well,
know.
it's a balance too, because the people you're bringing in, like you're bringing them in because they are creative, because they're innovative, they have an expertise. Like you are relying on their skill set as well. It's like, how do you balance tapping into that and having an expert in a room, or a bunch of experts in a room, with the need to. I had a track coach.
Overlap too,
Yeah,
like
there's
that's,
overlap.
yeah.
I think there's a recognition too. Like I had a track coach in college that gives me this piece of advice, and he's like, "Look, I require you to come every day at 100%. Now, when you're injured, 100% looks different than when you're heavily caffeinated and all your arms and limbs are fully functional for like to be at practice." And so he's like, if you can come every day and honestly say you give 100% effort, that is what I ask of you. And I think for us as a company culture, that's what we're asking of each other. When we have to pop in for childcare, if we have to pop out early to take care of a family matter, like that's required. Like that's part of who you brought into the space. That's the whole person. You have to work with the whole person.
I totally agree. That was, and that also was part of, anyway. Yes, that's been part of like the struggle and the secret at the same time, is completing everything, but also like making sure you are taking care of the whole person, especially as an employer.
Mhm.
So that's company culture that is going to last you for a very long time. So I applaud you for that. That's good.
Thank you.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you on this podcast that you wish that I had talked about, or something you would like to add in closing?
I think you asked great questions that like went
Uh,
really down to the core, so I really appreciate it.
I like what you do, and I genuinely admire what you do. It's so
Thank you.
cool.
I think the one thing I want to talk about, we spoke a little bit about it when we talked about about service delivery, but we look at ourselves as a hub of services. So when you look at a Mark or a LAC as a space, we're bringing lots of resources available so people can go from FEMA claim to insurance to Red Cross. We look at camp as that space. How can you be accessible to people if they're already dropping kids off and picking up kids for camp? How can you bring other services to them? How can you increase take-up rates in disaster relief funding? How can you make switching schools more accessible for folks? How can you make uh, meal service, take-home meal service? And we often will have a meal service provider who will provide us lunch and then will come later in the day for pickup so that families can take dinner home. And so we look at ourselves as a hub of services, and just looking at the ecosystem in general, how can we lower barriers for all of that kind of take up? That's how we're going to be able to get access to the things that we would like to provide people that we think are important, that they also want to know about.
I really like that for another reason too, which is I think that so many of us who work in this field, in the very beginning, when we first had our disaster, and then we would talk to other people in other parts of the country, and there was no really, like, this is why I started the podcast, like how to disaster, like how do you even do this, like what do you even do? Because people were asking always for a playbook. And
Yeah.
then it occurred to me that the playbook exists in all these human beings who have
Yep.
all of this knowledge and creativity and dedication and directed empathy, and
Mhm.
compassion, but have turned it into something, of great impact and service to the community. And it's good to have a toolbox, like you can write everything down, but there's no substitute almost for a community of collaborative people who are like, oh, okay, I'm hearing, like, you may think you're just telling me about the smoke damage in your home and this one thing,
Mhm.
but in my brain, I'm starting my matrix of who
Right.
does what and who might be able to help you, having nothing to do with what we do at all, but really
Yep.
we turn into the human playbooks for how to actually disaster. So that
Mhm.
the hub piece, I think, is very important for all of us to take on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I just want to thank you, Mikey, so much for being on the podcast, and also to Lorraine for the introduction. And really, I saw her at 2 conferences, and the last one I saw her at for U.S. Chamber of Commerce, she asked me again. I was like, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, it's
So
a small community.
it's a small community, and I just really want to thank you. And we will put information about Project Camp in the description, also about ACE, which is the Trauma Informed Care manual. We have people who worked on that who've also already been on the podcast, and it comes up again and again. So I think it's really important to have a link for that as well.
Thank you. I
Any other
appreciate
things
that.
that you think that we should include, we will. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.